the most powerful rocket ever built was fueled and ready. The weather was clear, the ocean was swept, and ships were already waiting on the other side of the world. Then SpaceX stopped the launch over a tiny flicker of pressure inside one metal arm. That decision tells you more about this company than any explosion ever has. A new documentary from inside SpaceX just showed how they really operate, and the version of SpaceX that lives in people's heads, the one that blows things up and shrugs, turns out to be wrong. And that arm was only the first absurdly small thing that nearly took control of this rocket. The program would also be held hostage by one broken chain link on the tower, a fleet of ships waiting in the Indian Ocean, and a cargo bay full of satellites that were never designed to work. It starts with the idea the film is made after. In engineering, the critical path is the longest chain of tasks that must all finish before the big thing can happen. Every link depends on the one before it, so if one link stalls, everything stalls with it. The rocket can be perfect, the team ready, the sea clear, and one small part on the tower can still become the only problem in the world that matters, which is exactly what happened before Flight 12. About 40 seconds before liftoff, the tower has to let go of the ship. An arm feeds super cold fuel into Starship, pressed hard against the rocket and held by a locking pin. That arm has to unpin and swing clear in a narrow window, or the rocket tears it apart on the way up. So the pin retracts, and the pressure inside the arm does something nobody expected. The team calls it a blip. Everything settles back to normal, so they try again, and this time the arm behaves differently. Then an engineer says the sentence that ends the day. He has no explanation for why it failed to unpin the second time. They scrub the launch. Sit with that. This is the company everyone calls reckless, the one famous for blowing up rockets on camera. And they walked away from a fueled Starship over a pressure reading they could not explain. That reveals the rule they actually fly by. SpaceX accepts an enormous amount of pain, including damaged hardware, ugly fixes, and rockets exploding in front of the whole internet. What it refuses to accept is behavior it cannot explain in a part sitting on the critical path, because an unexplained blip might be nothing, or it might be the small visible symptom of something much bigger underneath. One engineer says he has never felt pressure from Elon Musk to fly no matter what, then drops the line that reframes the company. The critical path to Mars is not blowing up rockets. So what was wrong with the arm? This was the first time it had been unpinned under real launch conditions, with a freezing cold rocket pressing against it. When the pin let go, the arm shifted toward the tower and jiggled, and that tiny movement tripped the tight limits on the hydraulic system. The arm itself was sound. It had simply never lived through that exact mix of pressure, cold, and force before. So overnight, SpaceX welded a hard stop onto it so it could not move as far. The next day it passed and they launched. But that welded stop only explains how they rescued one launch. It says nothing about why the tower was about to threaten the whole schedule all over again. Because here's the thing most people never realize. The launch pad is part of the rocket. SpaceX calls it Stage 0 because the tower and the arms take part in the mission, and if Stage 0 fails, Stage 1 never leaves the ground, and that ground takes a beating that's hard to picture. One engineer describes the booster as firing 11 Ford F-150 pickup trucks out the bottom of the rocket every second. Imagine the world's biggest machine gun, except it shoots trucks, which is what makes the next moment so brutal. Right after a successful engine test, that tower nearly stops the program. The team hears a violent noise, and the entire structure is shaking. Something has jammed in the chain that moves the giant chopstick arms. On a bike, you'd swap it in an hour. Here it sits high on a massive tower and was never built for a quick repair. So SpaceX calls its own people at Cape Canaveral, where spares exist for the Florida towers, and flies the part in overnight. Cranes come in, the old assembly is torn apart, the new one goes on, and the system is back in service in roughly 30 to 36 hours. One engineer calls it classic SpaceX nonsense. It's absurd, and it works. And that repair proves something bigger than heroic engineers. It shows a company built so one site can hand parts to another almost instantly, where the people closest to the hardware can put together a plan and move without waiting through layers of delay. SpaceX keeps putting itself in tight corners, and it built an organization that expects to be there. But fast repairs only explain how SpaceX saves a launch date. When a flight costs a fortune and may end at the bottom of an ocean, how do you make sure it actually teaches you something? Which brings us back to those ships waiting on the other side of the world. They were there to watch Starship die properly. SpaceX sends buoys, drones, and vessels deep into the Indian Ocean, with crews sailing 500 nautical miles from port, getting cameras online at 1 in the morning in rough seas.
This is the most important mission we've done out here. We're putting in the most buoys and the most drones. So if we don't have this data, the people back home have no idea how the heat shield really performed.
Telemetry can tell you a temperature, and it can never show you a missing heat tile. Cameras can. If the ship breaks apart on the way down or sinks after hitting the water, those images may be the only proof of how the shield held up. A flight that produces bad data is almost as wasteful as one that never leaves the pad. That same thinking explains the cargo. Flight 12 released 22 objects, and only 2 were real satellites. The other 20 were hunks of steel shaped like spacecraft, adding up to roughly 37 metric tons, which one engineer in the film calls heavier than any payload SpaceX had flown before. Steel dummies prove the release system can shove heavy objects out without jamming at a fraction of the cost. The 2 real satellites had another job. Once free, they turned their cameras around and filmed Starship in flight, and the control room erupted because that one image proved a long chain of systems had all worked at once. And that's the whole philosophy in one cargo bay. SpaceX refuses to spend an entire Starship test answering a single question when the same flight can also check payload weight, the release system, and how the ship looks from the outside. The unstoppable thing about SpaceX today is the machine that fixes the rocket. The real test is whether that machine can finally build a rocket that doesn't need saving. And Flight 13 is where that question gets tested next. SpaceX is throwing away both halves of the vehicle, sacrificing 20 satellites, and even making part of the heat shield look damaged on purpose. None of it makes sense until you see what they are actually trying to prove. That full breakdown is on screen now. I have a special thing prepared for when Flight 13 launches, so make sure to subscribe.